With everyone spending a lot more time at home lately, I don't know about you, but I'm spending a lot more time in the kitchen cooking. So I thought this year the DIY holiday gifts video would focus solely on items that you can use in the kitchen. Now before I go any further, I do want to point out that this is a woodworking video, which means that you'll require tools to build the things that I'm making. Now you don't have to have all the tools that I have in my shop, so as I go through, I'll try to point out some alternatives so you can build this too. I have these leftover pieces of ash wood that I'm going to plane down to roughly 7mm or 1/4 inch thick to make some spatulas. I wouldn't say ash is the ideal wood for spatulas, and given the choice, I might go with maple or even olive wood. So after getting them to thickness, I used these prototypes that I made to trace out the forms. You could use some spatulas you have at home or head over to my website for some free printable templates. Next, I used my bandsaw to cut out the forms. You might be able to get away with just a jigsaw here, but of course a bandsaw will be much easier. The idea here is to get just close to the lines and cut out a rough shape. The rest of the work will be done with a sander. With those done, I grabbed a slightly thicker 10mm piece of wood and traced out my third spatula design, and again cut out the rough form on the bandsaw. Before I started shaping them further, I made a hole using a 1/4 inch bit in all of the handles. Okay, so using my bench sander, the first step is to eliminate any tool marks and sand up to the line all around to refine our rough shape. If you don't have a bench sander, I've seen people find ways to clamp down their orbital sander, or this can all be done by hand, with a lot of patience. So with my rough shapes all done, it's time to refine them. This angled spatula is going to get a 45-degree chamfer on the tip just by holding it up against the belt sander like this. The next one is kind of like a crepe spatula, so I'm going to round over each side, sort of like a beaver tail, until the outer edges are really thin. Then I just rounded over the edges of the handle. For the large, hefty spatula, I started by rounding over all of the edges slightly to make it more comfortable to handle. I then focused on shaping the tip of the spatula by slowly grounding down each side on a slight angle until I had a thin tip, kind of like a wedge. Okay, so to recap, we've got this hefty spatula with a thin tip and a robust handle with rounded over edges. Next we have our crepe spatula, sorry about the focus, with a beaver tail-like shape. And lastly, we have a thinner angled spatula with a 45-degree chamfered tip. Now while they're in pretty good shape, I gave them a good hand sanding to refine the shape even further. This is how you really get those curves nice and smooth and make them look professional. After sanding up to 220 grit, I'm still not quite done. You'll want to spray them with water at this point to raise the grains so they don't get all rough the first time you wash them. Let them dry and hit them again with 220 grit paper. To give them a little style, I applied some painter's tape around the handle and applied 2 coats of paint. This is just regular latex wall paint I had left over. Once dried, I could remove the tape and check that I got a nice crisp line. It's important to really press down on the tape to get a nice seal before applying the paint. The last step is to apply some butcher block conditioner, let it sit for 20 minutes, and then rub it off. Next up, I'm going to make a charcuterie board, or really, it could just be kitchen decor up against your backsplash. You'll see what I mean. I'm again using my leftover ash wood and planing it down to about 11mm. Next, I cut a blank that's 10 inches long and 4 inches wide. And yes, I use both millimeters and inches. Sorry. I measured 2 inches from the side and from the top, then traced a semicircle touching the edges. On the other end, I used a small bottle cap to trace the rounded corners. I drilled through on the marking using a 1 1/4 inch Forstner bit, and then it's back to the bench sander to shape the edges. I slowly sanded away the excess wood using a circular motion until I reached the lines and was left with the shape I had traced out. Next, I used a small roundover bit to round over all the edges. Alternatively, you could use a handheld router for this instead, or even just a sander. Then came the inevitable sanding. Sanding up to 220 grit, then water popping to raise the grain, then sanding again. Just as before with the spatulas, I applied some painter's tape to get a crisp line, then painted the top part with a foam brush. I applied 2 coats and let it dry. Once dry, I applied some butcher block conditioner to the wood. Oh, and don't be afraid to get it on the paint, you can rub it over the entire board. Next up, I'm going to make a festive Christmas tree shaped serving board. Here I'm cutting a few pieces of walnut that I'll glue up into a panel. Now you can buy walnut that's been milled on all 4 sides and ready to use. The piece I have has been planed on both sides, so I just need to clean up the edges. To do this, you could use a jointer or a jointing/tapering jig like this. After getting one straight edge, I can remove it from the sled and cut the opposite side. Here I'm cutting up a few strips of ash wood that I'll use to spruce up my tree. I laid them out and got ready for glue up. This board will get washed, so you want to use some water resistant glue. By the way, you can find links to all the tools and materials I use in this video in the description down below. I'll also post details on all the dimensions in the written article on my website, and you'll find a link to that below as well. Okay, so after letting the board dry, I took it out of the clamps and I could see that it wasn't perfectly flat. Normally I would run it through my planer to even it out, but it's too wide, so instead I'll just sand it down until it's flat. This might take a while. It's kind of hard to see here, but I traced an outline of a Christmas tree that I'm going to lay over my board and use as a template to cut it out. But instead of laying it straight, I decided to put a bit of an angle on it, then used a glue stick to temporarily stick it in place. I could then use a utility knife to cut out the tree and score the board, ultimately transferring the outline onto it, which meant that I could then remove the stencil. Here's where the bandsaw comes in handy, but again a jigsaw could be used for this instead. This gave me a good opportunity to practice my bandsaw skills, and trust me, I need the practice. My lines are not exactly straight, but hey, it's supposed to be artisanal, right? It turned out pretty cool if you ask me, but we're not done yet. I cleaned up the bandsaw marks with my sander, which also allowed me to flatten some of the spots that were kind of wavy. I sanded everything up to 220 grit, making sure to break all the sharp edges too. Just as before, I'm going to water pop it and let it dry before the final sanding. I applied a liberal amount of butcher block conditioner, maybe a little too much, and massaged it into all the pores, then let it sit for 20 minutes and buffed it off. The last detail to make this serving board complete, I'm adding a few rubber cutting board feet underneath. And that's it! I really love how this one turned out. Alright, next up I'm making coasters, but not just any coasters, round coasters. Okay, so here I resawed some walnut down to about 3/8, but alternatively you could buy some 1/2-inch wood and plane it down, or just make thicker coasters. I'm making a really simple pattern, but you can go crazy here and make any pattern you want. I used these mini F-clamps to keep everything as flat as possible during the glue up. After removing the clamps, it feels flat enough that I can just give it a good sanding. If only my bench cookies would cooperate. Next, I cut 4 blanks using my miter gauge. Alternatively, you could use a miter saw for this. I want 4-inch round circles, so I'm making my blanks slightly oversized at about 4.5 inches. Alright, to cut the circles, I'm going to use my bandsaw circle cutting jig. It's a really simple jig, and if you want more details, be sure to check out my circle cutting video where I demonstrate 4 ways to cut circles. I measured 2 inches from the blade and inserted a pivot pin to make a 4-inch circle. Now I don't want to have to make any holes in my coasters, so I'll use this scrap piece of MDF as a dummy. After finding the center, I mounted it to the pivot pin. I could then simply use some double-sided tape to mount the blank to the dummy. And with that, I pushed the jig into place until it stopped, then rotated the piece around the pin until I had my first circle. After that, I was able to just reuse the same tape for the next piece, then cut out another circle. All that's left at this point is a bunch of sanding, including rounding over the edges. You could use a router for this, or just do it by hand like I did. Before applying finish, I like to clean them off using denatured alcohol. I chose to finish them with Osmopollux oil. It's just so easy to apply. Rub it in and wipe it off, and it gives a really silky, natural finish. Alright, well I hope this video gave you a few ideas of holiday gifts that you can make yourself. Here are a few other videos that you might be interested in watching too. Until next time, thanks for watching, see you soon.